Hi everyone, I've got a nice scene from Yorkshire. I can't remember exactly where it is. It's the Heartbeat Village. I'll have to look it up before I pop it onto YouTube. But I've had a request to do a little bit of pen and wash. So I'm going to have a go at some different pens and washes today. So it's going to give you a little bit of a new technique. So I have very carefully, just very lightly drawn out the scene. Normally if I was doing pen and wash I probably wouldn't do that. I'd go straight on with the pen, but it just gives you a chance to see what you're aiming for. It's quite an easy one from a perspective wise because they are face on, that you've only got a slight bit of the side build in there and there, because I took the shot from over in the centre here. Okay, so this variety of pens you can use, I'm going to give them all a go today. So you can have a drawing pen which will give a fine line. It's a little bit like a felt tip, and it is waterproof, so once it's dry it doesn't move. That's the one I probably use the most. It's really useful. I like the sepia colour. This one is actually a Papermate pen. It is a felt tip type pen that is water based, so it will move with water, so it can give some really nice interesting effects. If you haven't got a particular Papermate pen that is like a felt tip will probably do it, as would some of the gel pens. They tend to move a little bit as well when they're not dry. So there are two options. If you haven't got either of those, you could have a go with a biro. That would work really nicely. It's all about the movement of line, or even just pencil marks would work nicely as well. I'm also going to use a little bit of ink. So I've got a Daily Rounding ink, but you could use Quink ink. That has really nice effects as well. And either a nib of a feather, which is what I've got, or you could use a knitting needle, something sharp just to pop a few lines on. So we're going to have a variety of techniques today, and I've also got some colours mixed up. So colours wise, I've got raw sienna. I've just dabbed these out onto the palette. I'm going to be quite fluid with the washes, so you don't need to worry too much about mixing them up. So I've got raw sienna, I've got gamboge, I've got cobalt blue, I've got a bit of dioxazine violet or Winsor violet, or dioxazine purple, it depends on how it's labelled, but just a purple shadow colour, sap green, light red and cobalt blue. So the light red and cobalt blue is the only one that I've mixed up. The others are just neat in my palette, and I'll just load my brush when I'm ready to go. So less is always more when you're doing any sort of line and wash, and the best way to start it, I always find, is to get a bit of paint on, because it stops you doing too much with the pen. So I'm going to come in with some water on the sky. I'm not too concerned if I come over some of the building, it's fine. I've got this tree in Lucy over here. Again, I'm not too concerned. Just get some water on. Often you'll use this sort of technique when you're out and about sketching. So it tends to be a little bit looser. So I'm loading my brush up with some water, and I'm going to come in with a dab of raw sienna. So loaded my number 10 up, and then a dab of raw sienna onto that water filled brush, and then it won't be too strong. I'm just coming along and giving a really nice glow in the sky. Give my brush a good rinse, then dab into the water, pick up some cobalt blue, dab in again. So I'm going to be careful not to mix the two colours, because I don't want green in the sky. So every time I dab in, I'm making sure that I've got plenty of water on my brush. I don't want these colours to be too strong. There's quite a lot of light into this picture. So I've missed a bit of water there, I've got a dry mark, and that works really nicely, so I'm going to leave that. It's quite nice when you get an odd dry mark. Much more fluid than I'd normally be, this is. I'm going to dip into the grey, which is a cobalt blue and light red. Just add a little bit of that. Just gives a little bit of interest. And then I'm going to dab into the water again and into the raw sienna. And I'm just going to get a base on these distant hills. Now there is a lot of detail in this photograph and I'm going to omit quite a lot of that detail. It's up to you how much you want to put in, but it doesn't have to be everything. Less is always more. So the sky's still wet, so this is going to run a little bit into the sky, but we've got raw sienna right there anyway, so it's fine. And then I'm going to dab straight into a little bit of sap green and bring that through. Just to create a green hill there, really. And a little bit of the cobalt blue. And a little bit of the grey. Just going to come into this bottom section. So this is with no water on. Just bring a bit more of this grey in, just so it starts to blend. I've not put too many sheep in, I might put a few in later. It's up to you how many of those you want to put in as well. So I'm going to come along this section here. If you're leaving an odd sheep, you can come around that sheep. Left one here. This can add some. I can add some green to this later. It's just about getting a bit of a base on to work with. Okay, I'm going to dry that off and then come back to you. Okay, so that's dried really nicely now. That's given us a bit of a base to go by. I find that when I get paint on first, then I need less detail. So I already need less detail with the pen. that stops you from going mad with the pen. So the first one that I'm going to use is the water soluble one, and I'm going to start to come in and just create nice marks. It's all about the mark making. So I'm looking at this tree and I'm starting to create this tree. Now this is going to work really nicely with a water soluble pen because I can smudge this in later. Now I've done a lot of branches. If I come in, I can do a few little bits of foliage, but do not go mad with the foliage. I'm going to paint some of that in. The beauty is to do a bit of both. It's picking out a lot of the dark bits, so I want you to really watch what I'm doing with the pen. You don't want to eliminate all the nice wash of the watercolour. What I'm doing is picking out bits of shadow. So this is going to start to help to create this shrubbery this side. What I've also got is a bit of a wall here, so I can bring some work into this. Typically I find the black a bit harsh. I tend to use this sort of pen a bit more when I'm sketching outdoors and I'm just using it for just washing with water, so just to create a tonal effect. I tend to find that black does dull the colour and I prefer a sepia, but because this is the pen that I've got that's water soluble, I want to show you each of these techniques. So I've come along just creating different marks. I'm going to bring a little bit more just along this base. It's going to give a nice depth when we come in with the water and the paint later. I can bring in a few bits here, and this is going to start to create a little bit of shadow. It'll all become apparent as we're doing it. So I'm looking at the contours on the hills here and just picking those out. Let's bring a bit just along this edge, and I can bring some on the road as well. It might look like I'm scribbling, but I am making quite considered marks as to where they are. What I'm thinking about now is shadow on the road that I can see. I'm bringing that through. And then I'm going to run a little bit, again this is going to help with shadow underneath, just here. Okay, I'm going to come in as well now with my drawing pen. So this is the permanent pen. Once this is dry, it stays put. So this is the pen that I'd use to get the finer detail. So I'm coming along and looking at these chimneys. If you outline everything, it'll end up looking quite cartoony, so you must remember less is more all the time. Tiny little marks make all the difference. It's an indication of things, an indication of tiles. Let your brain fill everything else in. Tiles, shadow, You can have a little bit of shadow, a few little bits of tiles, a little bit of the window. Doesn't even have to be the whole window. Just come around the darker side. It'll still pick up as a window. It's probably the hardest thing to get, that you've got to do less. If you put every brick in, if you put every window pane in and outline it, it'll look flat. So you've got to, so this is a bit of foliage coming up, we're just going to start to define one side. Little squiggles, little squiggles. I'm going to give the sheep a little bit of a head and legs, but nothing else. I've purposely chose this photo because there's a lot of light in it, and it's going to stop you doing too much detail, because you actually can't really see, you can't even really see on here if there's a doorway or not, and that's going to stop you. Some of you will probably try to analyse quite a lot, stop you picking up too much detail. So I've put a few little lines on this roof to indicate some tiles. Another little sheep here. There's a head here. I'll probably lose that sheep there. Okay, so where there's little bits of trees and foliage, you can come in with a few little bits. Less is more. All the time, less is more. This gate is quite a useful one to do in permanent, because then it's not going to move later. So we can give an indication of a gate there. A few little squiggles. I'm going to fill in with some washes of watercolour. Remember, all this is going to move, so if you want any of the detail on with the pen, you can bring in a little bit. Okay, so I've now got the sepia ink. Now, the ink, you've got the best of both worlds. You can come on while it's still wet and it will move, and you can leave it to dry and it won't move. So you've got the best of both worlds with the ink. The beauty of using a nib is you get a variety of mark. So with a pen it's quite hard to get that variety, you don't get the thickness of line. It's especially good for foliage, so maybe I'll come in and create some extra bits on this tree that are a bit thicker. You're going to get that much more natural line. So you can really play. Take it a bit higher if you want. fact, we'll just pop a little bit of a trunk in with this one as well. Look, take a nice big tree right next to the cottage, and maybe a tree down here as well, just so you're getting the effect. It's great if you've got areas that are really dark and you want to pull those out. So maybe I'll pop a little bit down here and you'll see what's happening with that down there. Make sure, because it's acrylic, that you wash your brushes out and wash your nib off, because it will just dry on there. So I've got my round number 10, I've loaded it with water. And just so you can see what I mean about the acrylic, it's like when we would use it with watercolour. So if I just touch into that now, you're going to get that granulation, that movement with the water. I could come into this tree and just start to create a little bit of foliage, and that would pull that ink. The same with this one. Remember, I've got the combination of both the water-based ink and the acrylic ink in here, and I can start to pull this through and create some really nice foliage here. You could see here where I start to pull that shadow that I'd created. I'm going to apply some paint as well, so you get to see the effects with paint. This is this really dark wall. I can bring it through. See, it doesn't eliminate all the lines, which is really nice. You can still see the pen mark, but it's moving the watercolour at the same time. So if I bring a little bit of the grey onto this road section. So this is the watercolour I'm bringing on now, and it's going to mix. It's going to mix with the sepia, it's going to mix with the ink. And I could even add a little bit of cobalt blue in there as well. You get a really nice effect. So all those colours mixing together. The ink lifting. Okay, so I'm going to come in a little bit on this midsection now. So I can start to pick out this pathway. So this is just a little bit of raw sienna and mainly the ink moving. Take a little bit more of the raw sienna in to warm that up. And then I'm going to just dab into a little bit of gamboge. You can see that ink moving. And then some sap green. I want this to be nice and fresh. So it's got a really lovely sketchy effect to it. And all that shadow. You're meeting up to the edge here. You've got the green meeting the dark of the road. We have a little look at some of this foliage over this side that we've got to fill in, and I'm going to take a little bit of Gambogian. So I've just touched into that sepia ink there, and that's starting to run, which will be really nice. And then I'm going to take a little bit of the green in. And there's bits of foliage you can pick up in the background as well. It doesn't have to have the ink there for you to pick that up. I've just gone over my sheep there and dab that off. And I'm going to touch into a little bit of light red just in places. So I haven't got my brush loaded with water now, so I want this to stay put a little bit, so it's just a little bit of neat light red. Okay. I'm just going to touch this edge with water a little bit, just so it's not all sharp. And I'm just going to, just with a tiny touch of the green, just bring in a little bit into this tree. Just dabbing in. The marks are already there really. I'm quite happy with the marks in that tree. Okay, so I'm going to touch in now to the light red and just bring this into these roofs. If at any point you're struggling with your round number 10, it sort of depends how good your point is. You can move down to around number 6, that would work really well. I'm just going to dab into the grey a little bit. It's just a grey watercolour, a bit of variety there. Just bring that up so you can see that this other ink isn't moving at all. And then I can bring in the grey. Let's come down this side onto the building. It's quite nice if it's still wet with a roof. If you were outside doing this, you wouldn't dry it in between. It'll just blend through. You don't have to be too precise. If you can see where I'm touching the ink, where we ran the dark underneath, you can see that that's blending and creating a nice shadow as well. And then come into this one. Odd bits of white work really nicely. Capture the light. So you've got a little bit of foliage. So I'm just going to dab a little bit of green in places, and that will mix with the grey. Now I'm going to drop down to round number 6, load that with water and touch into the cobalt blue. Cobalt blue is a great colour for windows. I'm just going to dab in places. So If you said half the window needed to be white, half the window needed to be cobalt blue, that would pretty much work, and it's just random. Just an odd dab here and there. I'm just going to dry that off and then I might do a few tweaks. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just add a little bit more depth on the roofs. So I'm just coming over with a little bit of light red, just to give them a little bit more depth so they stand out a bit more. I'll take a bit of shadow. Just going to pick up a little bit of violet. Just bring that onto the front door here for a bit of shadow. If you've got any sheep and you want to give them a tiny bit of shadow, then the violet's a better colour for a bit of white shadow. Just going to dip into a little bit more gamboge. Just bring that through. See if I can just warm up this front section a little bit. So it's a very different effect than using just standard watercolour, but it's a really interesting effect. You get a much more abstract feel. There's much more movement in the picture because of all the lines. I'm going to bring a little bit of a wash of blue just through this on the road at the bottom as well. So it's something you can really have a good play around with. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you next week.